Коллеги,
Dear colleagues and friends, good afternoon. We're about to start the press conference by the Governor of the Bank of Russia, Elvira Nabiullina, and the Deputy Governor, Alexei Zabotkin. And to begin with, we'll hear the statement by the Governor following the Board of Directors meeting, please. Good afternoon. Today, we have made the decision to cut the key rate to 18% per annum. Inflation, including its underlying component, is decelerating. The growth of consumer demand is slowing down gradually, and the expansion of lending is moderate. All these factors allow us to further cut the key rate. It is tight monetary policy that has become a fundamental factor behind disinflation and the return of the economy to a more balanced growth path. We should therefore be prudent in making our further key rate decisions. Monetary policy should remain tight during a long period to ensure a sustained return of inflation to low levels. I would now dwell on the reasons behind our today's decision. Firstly, the deceleration of inflation has become more pronounced. Since the previous meeting, we have obtained a comprehensive view of the situation in May and June and can state that the current price growth rates over these 2 months approached 4% in annualized terms. Most measures of underlying inflation decreased to 4 to 6% as well. This happened earlier than we had forecast. Annual inflation slowed down to 9.2%. Given the current price dynamics, we have revised our forecast downwards to 6-7% as of the end of this year. The variance of price growth rates across the main goods and services groups, as well as across Russian regions, has somewhat decreased. However, it is still notably larger as compared to the period when inflation was low. Over the previous months, we were concerned about quickly rising prices for services because price movements in this segment are a good indicator of domestic demand dynamics. We can now see that price growth has started to decelerate in those market services where prices are less affected by one-off factors. These are, for instance, healthcare and personal services. Nevertheless, price pressures remain elevated in these segments and most notably in public catering. This is associated with, among other things, structural factors such as changes in consumer preferences towards services, out-of-home food, and domestic tourism. As for non-food goods, the lowest price growth rates were recorded in the segments of electronic devices, household appliances, and cars. Prices for certain items such as computers, tablets, and home appliances have been declining for several consecutive months. Durables are the segment where the transmission of high interest rates to price is the strongest and quickest. Interest rates impact price through both a reduction in consumer lending and a stronger ruble. In May and June, a slower rise in prices for certain volatile components of the consumer basket, such as fruit and vegetables, as well as tourism services, also contributed to disinflation. In July, vegetables have continued to cheapen faster than usually during the season, which is evidenced by the latest weekly statistics on price growth. However, monthly price growth rates in July will be higher overall than over the previous months, primarily because of the indexation of utility tariffs. Higher tariffs not only contribute to inflation directly, but may also involve the so-called second-round effects. Here is what I mean saying this. A significant rise in prices for socially important goods or services can affect household inflation expectations. This, in turn, will be influencing their decisions on consumption and savings and, accordingly, the overall price growth. It is crucial to take it into account, this risk, because inflation expectations remain elevated. They have stayed nearly unchanged among households over the past few months and have even edged up among businesses in July for the first time over a long period. I would like to stress that although the current price growth rates have already approached 4%, the downward trend should still consolidate. Secondly, the economy. The expansion of demand is decelerating gradually and is becoming increasingly consistent with the economy's capacities to ramp up output. This is a key factor of disinflation. Manufacturers are decreasing their expectations regarding the rise in demand, especially in the consumer segment. Investment activity remains high, including owing to government support in priority sectors. We expect that investment will expand this year, although its growth rate will be lower than over the previous 2 years. Labour market tightness has somewhat decreased recently. The number of companies reporting staff shortages has declined. Enterprises plan a more moderate indexation of wages this year. However, the current growth rate of wages in the economy as a whole is still higher than that of labour productivity, according to our assessments. Unemployment stays record low. Staff shortages remain a risk factor for inflation. If the expansion of domestic demand accelerates again without a commensurate increase in productivity, it will soon clash with the deficit of labour resources and will largely translate into price growth. Thirdly, monetary conditions remain tight but have slightly eased compared to June. Nominal interest rates have decreased in most segments of the financial market. This has resulted from the reduction in the key rate and market expectations regarding its future path. Real interest rates have declined less notably, taking into account the slowdown in the current price growth. The tightness of non-price lending conditions has generally remained unchanged. Credit is expanding more slowly than over the previous 2 years. The trends stay uneven across the segments. The consumer loan portfolio has continued to contract, whereas mortgages and corporate lending have been increasing moderately. According to our assessments, credit activity is affected by more modest demand for borrowing rather than by credit supply constraints associated with banks' capital adequacy or macroprudential requirements. The annual growth of lending to organizations and households has continued to decelerate, generally in line with our expectations, just like the expansion of money supply. The growth rates of household deposits have edged down since the beginning of the year. Such a decrease is natural as the expansion of money supply, lending, and incomes decelerates. Nevertheless, deposit rates remain attractive and the demand for time deposits is still high. I would like to remind you that when we identify whether households prefer to consume or to save, we factor in not only deposits but also loans and compare them against income dynamics. We assess how much of their incomes households use to consume, save, or repay debts, as well as whether they raise more loans for new purchases or not. Combined, the trends in these indicators now show that households still prefer to save, and people's propensity to save remains at a record high level. As monetary policy tightness decreases, the savings rate will be declining, but this will be a gradual process. This means that household savings will continue to grow, albeit more slowly. This is in line with the objective to maintain low inflation. Briefly about external conditions. As compared to April, we have revised downwards our forecast of Russian crude prices to $55 per barrel for 2025 and the next year. Trade tensions between the largest economies will be weighing on external demand, while an expansion of OPEC plus oil production will increase the supply of oil. In these conditions, we have also slightly decreased the forecast of exports and the current account surplus for the next 2 years. The ruble exchange rate is affected by flows not only in the current account, but also in the financial account of the balance of payments. Owing to high interest rates, ruble assets remain more attractive to Russian households and companies as compared with foreign assets. Coupled with more moderate demand for imports, this ensures the stability of the ruble exchange rate despite a slight decline in exports. I will now speak of risks to our baseline forecast. I have already mentioned the key ones, which are risks associated with the inflation expectations and the labour market. In this regard, we are still far from a situation where we could say that the danger of price growth acceleration has passed. The risks of a deterioration in the terms of external trade, primarily associated with the decline in global oil prices, as well as geopolitical risks, persist. Overall, pro-inflationary risks still prevail. Nevertheless, making our decisions, we take into account disinflationary risks as well. The main one of them is a faster cooling in credit and demand than expected in our baseline forecast. Fiscal policy remains an important factor for our forecast. We assume that the government will stick to the fiscal rule in 2025 and further on. If the fiscal parameters change, we might need to adjust the projected key rate path. Winding up, I would like to comment on our future decisions. We are on the way back to the inflation target, but this journey is not over yet. We can already see the first results, which have allowed us to cut the key rate again today, gradually adjusting the monetary policy tightness to the easing of inflationary pressures. Furthermore, we have revised downwards our forecast of the average key rate to 18.8, 19.6% per annum in 2025 and 12 to 13% per annum in 2026. However, the return to the target does not mean just a few months of the current price growth rate being close to 4%. The return to the target implies stabilizing inflation at a sustainably low level, including both the actual inflation rate and inflation perceived by household and businesses, which is what we call inflation expectations. To achieve this result, we need to be patient and prudent in our decisions, especially when disinflationary trends have emerged just recently, preceded by a long period of elevated inflation. Monetary policy has ensured the reverse of the trend, and inflation has started to decelerate. Therefore, monetary policy should remain tight for as long as needed to sustainably bring inflation back to 4% in 2026 and stabilize it close to this level. Thank you for your attention. Now, dear colleagues, we start the Q&A. Please introduce yourself and identify your agencies. Nasty, in the second row, please. Anastasia Savelova, Interfax Agency. Is there any room or space remaining for the similar broad steps to bring the key rate down worth the 200 basis points, or you would prefer to make it no more than 100 basis points at a time, due to the fact that the monetary policy is easing and considering the fact that you keep your growth forecast for this year? Do I understand correctly that you don't see any risks in the economy due to the monetary tightness, and consequently you don't see any risk for the quality of the credit portfolio amongst the banks to worsen, and you are not debating any options to support any banks, including the major ones, or any financial administration? Well, in your single question, you ended up having so many of them. I haven't had time to write all of them down. All right. I may need that later. Okay, so in as far as our further steps are concerned, with regard to our monetary policy decisions, if you take a look at our key rate forecast, it envisages that before the end of the year, at separate board meetings, it would be possible to bring it down at a step of 100, 200 basis points, as well as make a pause. It would all depend upon the incoming data. But in terms of an even downward trajectory, is what we may follow, given a more convincing picture about the stabilization of inflation and the reduction of inflation expectations being at a low level and no more inflationary shocks. At this point in time, we anticipate different steps that we may follow. Now, as far as the risks of worsening of the situation in the banking sector and the additional capitalization for the banks, well, we don't see any need to make major banks additionally capitalized because of any potential overhang of bad debts, because the banking sector is profitable. I shall remind you that considering the first half year, the profit was 1,700,000,000, which is a big number, profit-wise, which allows banks to maintain capital adequacy, to grow their capital positions. And the real situations where the bad debts and the bad credits at times is better than some are trying to present it. For example, we do see the value of the credit risk, which is the average level of reserves ratio to the credit portfolio. So with regard to the corporate portfolio, it is far from historic records, 0.9% annualized, which is a normal historical level of the cost of risk for the Russian banks, just comparison-wise, I shall remind you that in the first half of 2021 it was above 3%. So it's a normal level now. So in retail, the expectations are a bit higher, 3.4% thereabouts, which is above the norm. I would say this is an average historical norm is at 2%, but this is not being critical because the uncollateral, unsecured credits are covered by reserves 90%, worth of 90%. So this is quite a huge coverage. In mortgages, a bit less, less than 70%, 67%, but they're not good quality collaterals in their securitization in there. So we don't see here any risks as far as the banks are concerned. I mean, indeed, the capital is not even throughout the sector, I mean, distributed amongst the banking industry, but that may impact different rates of credit growth that the banks are going to try and support. Thanks very much, dear colleagues. Rita, in the first row. Thanks very much. Rita Shpilevskaya from the TAS agency. Dear colleagues, traditionally we would like to find out what were the options on the table and whether you discussed adjusting the neutral range of the key rate. Thank you. Today, in the process of our discussion, we reviewed several options of reducing the key rate. We didn't consider keeping it as it was. So it was 100, 150 and 200. But more substantively, we discussed the 100 and 200 basis points reduction. Now, in terms of the neutral rate, we update our basic monetary policy guidelines, and Mr. Zabotkin will comment our evaluation of the neutral range. We haven't reviewed it and reconsidered, and it's not going to be reconsidered in the basic guidelines because clearly the basic forecast of the July board meeting, which we published today, the neutral rate in real terms is 3.5, 4.5, 7.5, 8.5 in nominal terms. And so, indeed, after we looked into all of the factors, which are going to be more in more detail described in the main guidelines, that there was no substantive discussion or the reconsideration. As part of varying the main guidelines, we considered the neutral range because that was the subject of our analysis, but we didn't find any reasons to review and change the neutral range, neutral key rate right now. Yana, please. Yana Churechkina, RIA Novosti. Today, you reduced the key rate second time in a row. Now the interest rates on mortgage and deposit the banks continue to bring down. So what do you think? Is it already time now to spend one's deposit on mortgage loans, or one should just sit and wait? Well, every time I refrain from, giving universal kind of advice because people find themselves in absolutely different situations. The need in mortgage instruments is something that may understand that they should have in case they need to improve their housing conditions and they're short of a certain amount of money. So situations differ, absolutely. And so people compare not only the mortgage and the bank deposit, but also the possibility to make investment into the stock market, because we believe that the deposit shall remain attractive for a continuous period of time, despite the fact that the key rate is down, because we're going to be bringing down the key rate gradually as the inflation subsides, and we will act on the premise that the deposit rates shall remain above inflation. I mean, they would enable one to ensure the savings from losing their values. But it's individually decided. Thanks very much. The next question comes online from Andrei Pushkarov, the Russian Gazette from the city of Vladivostok. Why, in the very same Western countries, there is an enormous government debt, but very low inflation and a very symbolic key rate? Maybe we should follow the same way to curtail inflation with the strictest possible measures, all the way up to the criminal persecution of those who enjoy rising interest rates and really make the banks take the right place with their unsatiated appetite. Well, what can I say? Economic laws, they work in a slightly different way. And that is, first, the high rates, they bring inflation down, and then the interest rates become low. Any attempts to try and dodge this causality, you can look into the history, comes very dear. It's like you cannot put the cart in front of the horse. So the countries where the rates are low are the ones where inflation is low. And the second thing, which is not least important, are the countries where people are sure that inflation shall remain low. Speaking in economic vernacular, low anchored inflation expectation. But I should remind you that when in the very same countries there used to be high inflation, they also had to keep their key rate at a very high position. For example, in the United States in the beginning of 1980s, the key rate sometimes reached 19%, with inflation at 15%. And so the interest rate above 10%, the key rate 10%, stayed for 3 years. Other countries followed similar experience. However, after these countries, with the help of the high key rate, were able to battle and win over the high inflation, and inflation transformed into the stable low one, they enjoyed using the results of such low inflation for a very long period of time. The government debt starting growing up after the inflation went down to 2%. And again, these low interest rates are possible only when inflation is brought down. Now, what concerns the administrative price regulation, this is really a dead end, because it leads one only to deficit and to the black market really exploding. I think we've been able to be convinced by it through our own long old experience. So what we're trying to achieve is so that the demand is not running ahead of the output, and the key rate enables one to make the productivity and the demand match. And only this may help to achieve a stable inflation. And if that happens, then the rates in the economy, the interest rates, will become palatable. Marina Pimitova, NTV Business News. During one of the previous press conferences, you mentioned that the high key rate is an effective medicament. The comparison became so obvious that it's really worthwhile continuing it. For example, doctors has the ranking for pain in between 1 to 10. If you give the same one to inflation, where 1 is bearable, 10 is unbearable. So what do you think? At which particular part of this scale we are now? You know, the central banks do run their own scaling for inflation these days. Low inflation is the one that people almost do not notice. For Russia, this is close to 4%, but in many other countries, it's like 2%, and they believe this is low one. No. Or the 4% is what these countries would believe to be too high. Of course, there are different assessments of high inflation, from moderately high, the one that we're currently walking out, from very high, when the inflation runs up, to very high double-digit one. When inflation is so high, it doesn't allow people to plan, and the economy becomes very vulnerable to external shocks. And the most dangerous thing is that such a high inflation it may transform itself into hyperinflation, because we had such a situation back in 1992 when prices jumped up 25 times. Luckily enough, this is not what we are facing these days. But if one is to continue your healthcare illusion, we believe that we still need time to make sure that the decrease in inflation currently taking place is us becoming well, rather than simply getting rid of symptoms. Colleagues, please, Rita. Rita Mordovna, please. Margarita Mordovna, RBK. During earlier communications, the Bank of Russia noted a significant contribution into the strengthening of rubles and into the inflation. But at the same time, it stated that it is necessary to first make sure that the ruble appreciation is stable. Now, given the current situation, when for 7 months in a row, ruble is gaining its value against the dollar, can one say that this is a stable process, or is it something that is not yet predictable for the central bank, and anything that may change may affect it also, and this may change? Back in June, we said that based on our estimates, the basic part of the ruble appreciation can be explained specifically by the tight monetary policy effects. As a fundamental kind of a factor, the exchange rate, principally, one may consider as an independent contribution to inflation when this is a consequence of external conditions or export or import fluctuations. But the appreciation this year is the manifestation of the higher ruble-denominated rates, tight monetary policy. In other words, the exchange rate strengthening in the part where it has been brought about by the monetary policy is one of the manifestations, one of the channels via which our rate impacts inflation and the demand, rather than some individual one-off additional factor which may start living its own life. Or simply just disappear. Of course, there may take place a certain dramatic downfall in the external conditions of this scale that through this currency channel, through the exchange rate changes, it would pull us back from achieving the 4% inflation in 2026. And in this case, we would definitely be ready to adjust the key rate trajectory. Next one, please, Sergey. Sergei Bolotov, the Russian Gazette. My question is related to the inflation expectations, which got stuck, not for the first months, at a high level of 13%. The observed inflation is also high. Most of the people don't believe that the solid ruble, sound ruble, shall remain with us for long. Doesn't the Central Bank of Russia afraid that this may bring about another spiral of inflation in the process of lowering down the key rate? We're going to be doing everything, and we will reduce the key rate in such a way so as not to allow this spiral of inflation to happen. And of course, we are concerned by the elevated inflation expectations, and that is what we're openly stating. We expect that the inflation expectations will follow suit with a gradual decrease in inflation, like the case was in 2017. If it doesn't, that would simply narrow our space for maneuvering in reducing the key rate. But in any case, what we're going to do is not to allow this spiral to take place. Mr. Zapotkin, well, basically speaking, in reference to a prudence to be exercised in any future decisions, like what we've heard from the statement by the governor, is essentially an allusion to us acting, looking very, very tightly at what is going to happen with inflation expectations. Thank you. The next question comes online from Viktor Lebedev, the Hakassia newspaper from the city of Abagan. Thanks very much, dear colleagues. Good afternoon. Well, basically, my question is something that many are worried about. Different countries want different monetary policy. There is Turkey with a key rate of 46, inflation 35%. Argentina, where the key rate is 29, with inflation 40. In Russia, as we all know, it's around the other way around. But my question is, do you take into account the experience that these countries go through in our monetary policy? And my second question, what will happen if we will radically reduce the key rate, let's say twice as much? What kind of risks that may bring into the economy? Thank you. Of course, we are monitoring what other countries are doing successfully, as well as what they're doing to curb already running inflation. And what you are referring to resonates with our approaches, which is that the decrease in inflation can be done by maintaining high interest rates, key rates, to hold back demand when the inflation expectations funds are running away. But you must be very specific speaking about it, because the tightness of the monetary policy, it may not be totally correct to assess it based on the difference between today's key rate and the inflation over the past 12 months, because the annual inflation is the past, because it may tell you how tight or easy, considering the circumstances the monetary policy used to be over the past 12 months. The current tightness would be more correct to assess on the basis of the expected inflation by the businesses, by the households, or at least compare the current price growth rates, monthly, adjusted to the seasons, annualized as well, and compare it to the key rate. So when the inflation slows down from higher levels than the current price growth rates, I mean the monthly ones, for example, they are much lower than the annual ones. If you analyze it against the current growth rates, they're much lower than what we remember from the beginning of the year when the prices were very high. Like in our case, the annual inflation is 9%. Now it is above 9%, the current 4 and 6. And so both in Turkey and Argentina, the current price growth is at 20%. I mean, annually adjusted. And so that is much higher than in our case, but this is a very strong slowdown from the peaks they used to have, like 80% in Turkey, from 300% in Argentina, where inflation back in 2022-23 really flew very high as a result of the monetary policy easings, as well as various fiscal deficits. And so the inflation started going down only after a considerable key rate increase and the fiscal consolidation. The 43% key rate in Turkey and 29% in Argentina, respectively, are strongly above the current inflation. Like I already told you, currently it's at 30%. But even looking at these cases, one may construe that there is no mechanical relationship between the key rate and the current price growth rate. So, as always, we used to say, and even now I shall reiterate it, the monetary policy is being defined by the general economic picture. And so, of course, we do analyze not only the mistakes other countries do, but also the positive things that they endeavor. For currently, Turkey and Argentina are following the same kind of journey like back in 1980s and the beginning of the 90s. All the countries went through, which over the past 30, 40 years, in their cases, were able to keep most of the times stable, low inflation. So just to make a suggestion to reduce the key rate, irrespective of inflation and the high price growth, may lead only to higher prices and the inflation spiral. And we believe that this is something that one definitely shouldn't do. Mr. Zabotkin, yes, now since somebody said that it should be reduced almost twice, that is exactly what Turkey did in 2021. From 24%, it brought it down to 10% without looking at the fact that at that point in time, inflation was 10% and demonstrated an accelerating trend. So that was the result. And in 2023, inflation went up to 85, and it went down only after the key rate was raised almost up to 50%. So that is a very appropriate historical case which tells us that the key rate must conform to the level of inflation and inflationary expectations in order to avoid such situations. You're absolutely right. One should learn what others are doing rather than think that in our case everything works differently and that any experiment like that will be left unpunished. No, prices will jump up. Varvara, next one, in the row before the last one. Varvara Mikhalchova, market power. Last year, we were witnesses to the way macroprudential limits were so important for the monetary policy. So we would like to better understand the logic that the Bank of Russia is following in applying such regulatory measures. If the review of the key rate, as a rule, is taking place within a certain calendar format and is being accompanied by such discussions like what you had today, then the changes in the macroprudential standards would be a more pinpointed thing. Now, don't you see in this a certain information asymmetry or communication asymmetry? And how are we to better understand the rationale of the Bank of Russia in applying macroprudential measures, what is that we should go for in the first place? Yes, thank you for your question, but I would like to emphasize once again the differences in the macroprudential policy and the monetary policy. We don't use macroprudential policy as an instrument of support or replacement of the monetary policy. This is an independent kind of policy. Its target is to restrict systemic risk. It's a different matter when the credit boom is taking place. The banks are not inclined to so conservatively assess their borrowers and their credit worthiness. I mean, they are ready to take more risk, and that brings about both the risks for the citizens as well as the businesses, as well as for the banks themselves. And to demand strict macroprudential measures is what we do in order to limit such risks. And therefore, with the help of macroprudential measures, we limit lending to households with high debt burden. And this year we started also limited lending to corporates with a high debt burden. Now, with regard to more systemic approaches in the macroprudential policy, generally speaking, the international application of it is still quite young, because I think we're one of the countries which is actively applying such measures. Not so long ago, I think it was in May, when we published a report about the fundamental approaches to macroprudential policy measures, where we specifically described our decision-making mechanisms. And as of this year, these decisions are comprehensively reviewed at special board of directors meetings, so that we could see all of the measures as one, because before that we would consider the limitations to be imposed at one time, then something at a different time. Now we look at it comprehensively. Now yet another meeting dedicated to the macroprudential measures is going to take place next week, but in order to have more predictability with regard to our macroprudential policy decisions, we also made up our mind as of the next year, 2026, we're going to publish the schedule of the Board of Directors meeting specifically dedicated to the macroprudential agenda. So this information asymmetry that you're referring to is not going to be anymore. Thank you, dear colleagues. Irina, in the row before the last one. Thank you. Elvira Nabiullina. Money Doesn't Sleep channel. My question is about ruble. What do you think? To what extent ruble is vulnerable to the expansion of the fiscal deficit against the key rate reduction, and considering the fact that we also have certain internal borrowings? Well, the ruble's sensitivity to the government spending growth and the fiscal deficit is limited. And actually, irrespective of the ways of funding it, and so our forecast and our key rate decision is what we put into all factors: business activity, internal demand, credit conditions, fiscal policy, the way the key rate impacts exchange rate, and where it says the future key rate trajectory, considering the overall risk balance. So there aren't any risks that we are seeing. Dear colleagues, please, Oleg, in the last row. Thank you. Good afternoon. Oleg Sapushkov, Kommersant newspaper. Could you speak up, please? Oleg Sapushkov, Kommersant newspaper. Sorry. Could you be more specific, if I may ask, in terms of the currency component in the monetary policy? May one say that the pro-inflationary factor in the depreciation of the ruble is going to be compensated by the bigger fiscal income and won't negatively impact the monetary policy? Well, in as far as the exchange rate dynamics influence is concerned, like I used to say, in its capacity as an individual factor, we don't consider it like that, because this is the factor which is dependent upon our monetary policy. And a tight monetary policy, against all other things being equal, does affect the exchange rate stability. But at the same time, we do monitor the way the fiscal policy is generating what kind of effects, because we act here on the parameters that have already been announced by the government. Whether something compensates for anything else, I don't see this happening. Maybe Mr. Zapotkin will tell us whether there is any compensatory effects. No, this is not the kind of logic that we are following in our attitude towards it. Dear colleagues, please. Natasha, in the last row. Natalia Troshina, Moscow Komsomolets. My question is about sanctions. Since 2014, more than 30,000 different sanctions have been imposed upon Russia, most of them upon the financial sector. EC recently introduced 18th package and immediately started thinking about the 19th one. Now, the special thing about the new sanctions is not that just 22 new banks have been disconnected from SWIFT, but all the transactions are being banned. So we're talking about further strictness. Now, I would like to find out how serious this is a blow to the Russian financial sector. And throughout this period of time, what kind of sanctions turned out to be the hardest one for the financial sector? And now, in the light of the further 19th package, what kind of additional blows upon the Russian financial system one should expect, and whether the monetary authorities are ready to stand against it? Well, I wouldn't hypothesize about the kind of blows that can be dealt to the financial sector. But we do see that the financial sector is one of the targets for the application of sanctions, and the sanctions are becoming tougher. I don't actually remember that there have been a single year recently without the sanctions becoming tougher. So, I mean, the sanctions is the kind of risk that we always are aware of. We know that it is there. We also have alternative scenarios apart from the baseline one, because within the baseline one, we, hypothesize that the sanctions don't change, but also run the risk scenarios within which we also consider sanctions becoming harder. But what can I tell you? Generally speaking, in terms of the financial sector, resilient, because I believe that the practical situation have demonstrated that it is resilient, and we are running the kind of policy for this resilience not to fall. Macroprudential markups, as well as going back to the markup standards that there used to be. It all takes place according to plan, supporting the capital adequacy. Sometimes the banks are complaining that we're running a tough regulation, but we do believe that it is very important to maintain the resilience in the banking system, because that is the most important thing in order to be able to withstand any external shocks, being sanctional ones or generally coming from the global economy. So the financial institutions themselves are very well aware of this risk, because it is not happening out in limbo, because they understand that there is a risk like that, and so their risk mitigation policy is what they develop based on the probability of it. So I do say that the financial sector is very resilient to the sanctions. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. Maria, in the second row. Maria Filushina, Bitkogan. During the last press conference, used to say that the GDP dynamics goes closer to the lower threshold of the forecast, but the Bank of Russia didn't change at the same time its economic growth forecast. Does it mean that as of the last board meeting, the Bank of Russia now has chosen a more positive view upon the future of the economic growth? Well, indeed, we haven't changed our GDP assessment for the current year. We also see that there might be a possible support for GDP coming from the recovery of exports and the mineral resource production in view of respective changes in the OPEC plus policies. I don't remember whether I mentioned that it is closer to the lower threshold. I don't remember it either. I think something that we mentioned then was that as of the beginning of June, data showed that second quarter was a little bit lower compared to the short-term forecast for the second quarter published in the comments to this forecast. Simultaneously, by the beginning of June, we didn't have the May data because it was coming later. So overall, the first quarter actually ended up being very, very close to the forecast. Thanks very much. The next question comes from online from Denis Yalahovsky. Good afternoon. The utility company tariffs led to the growth of the inflation rate by 1%. So does the Bank of Russia believe that later on is going to be compensated by what the households are spending on other goods and services? And to what extent the Bank of Russia believes that the annual tariff growth may be in the way for the Bank of Russia to anchor inflation expectation at a lower level? So this is my question and a half. I'm sorry. Thank you very much. I suppose that one must not talk about full neutralization of the fact from tariffs being raised for the utility services through the fact that other consumer spending may be postponed or stopped. It may happen to a certain extent in terms of what people still keep after they pay for utility services. However, some of those households which enjoy having some savings, they may reduce their propensity towards savings. I mean, people shall continue to consume their habitual products and services by simply reducing the amount of money that they are saving or plan to save. So the extent to which this neutralization may happen is difficult to be precise. To a certain extent, it might be there. But your second half of the question is also very important. I mean to say that the utility tariffs growth does push the inflation expectations up when such tariffs grow higher than inflation. Well, yes, this is not the kind of factor that will help inflation expectations to get anchored, and unanchored and elevated inflation expectations, the kind of factor that may force the central bank to keep the key rate higher compared to anchored inflation expectations. Mr. Zapotkin, this is something that we always underscore, that if there is part of the consumer basket, particularly such a pronounced one like payment of utility tariffs that grow higher than the target level, then the rest of the basket will be appreciating slower in order for the inflation to be capped at 4% target. Olga, next one in the last row. Right now, many who would like to apply for mortgage lending want to have stable rates. And so the question is, at which level you believe people will go for the mortgage lending? And at what level of the key rate you predict in order for us to go back to the level of the mortgage lending activity that we used to have a year and a half ago? Well, I think I already answered one of the previous questions and said that people, take a mortgage loan depending upon their individual situations, upon their life situations, and but if one is to truly talk about when a mortgage solution may considerably grow without any fiscal support, without en masse and very dear support measures. I would like to remind you of the period when inflation was at 4%, which was 2017-2018, when mortgage sector started developing very actively, and mortgage rates used to be at about 8 and 9%, but the inflation then was at 4%. So will it now go back to the levels of about 1.5 years ago? I don't think so, because during the past year and 2 years, the mortgage lending growth was too high. It was an overheated sector, which led to a situation where housing prices demonstrated very speedy growth. And essentially, in many regions, availability of housing didn't grow. It went down simply because people had to go for bigger loans, although at a lower rate, simply because the cost of a square meter went up. So an unbalanced dynamics in the mortgage lending, which reminds me of the rates of 17-18. This is something that you should rather keep in mind to understand what's going on. Jacob, in the first row, please. Jacob Timokoja, expert magazine. Today and during the Financial Congress, you've mentioned that the labor market demonstrates not very dramatic situations. More companies fall out of the wage race, not because the trend changed, because before May, the unemployment rate went down to 1 or 2%. Most probably, like the report stated, the possibility to carry forward the growing cost upon the wages ran out. So what is the level of unemployment that the central bank believes acceptable, the one that would draw less attention when making a decision about the key rate? And how probable is the fact that the unemployment rate before the end of the year will exceed 1.5%? Well, we're not publishing the labour market outlooks, particularly since we don't have any objective to define a comfortable level of unemployment or not. But of course, we are closely monitoring the labour market situation because this is an important one, particularly right now when making a decision with regard to the monetary policy. At the same time, the level itself of what is being described, of a natural unemployment, it may fluctuate in time because of different reasons. To us, the very basic thing, for our policy, it is important for the situation in the labour market to be in line with our 4% inflation target. But what specifically does it mean? That's why I'm saying our target is 4%. Now, on the qualitative side of it, the shortage of labour should soften up, and it means that the wage growth should run in compliance with the productivity growth. And for us, this is the criteria demonstrating that the labour market is normal. But unemployment not necessarily has to grow, because some industries, they close their needs. They're able to meet their needs in terms of their demand for labour quicker. Others are optimizing headcounts, and so people move from one companies to others, from one sector to another sector. Currently, what we see is that tensions in the labour market is subsiding, is diminishing, and like we've demonstrated in the report that you referred to in the recent issue of the regional economics, because there's a special part of it dedicated to the labour market. And it is true that the number of companies who would like to optimize that has gone up by 6%. But I would like to draw attention to still the majority of enterprises are not planning to do it. The number of companies which would like to expand their headcounts is now twice as much, because when the deficit was higher, then it was also bigger. But now the number of companies who would like to optimize their headcount is twice as lower compared to those who simply would like to increase it. And these are the companies who are expanding, who are developing their output because of a high demand for their product. So whatever is currently happening, we are emphasizing it in our answers to many questions, because looking at one industry or at one enterprise, you cannot really generalize it over the whole economy. Some are expanding their operations, while others are simply optimizing it. Thank you. Colleagues, please. Nikita. Good afternoon. Nikita Mitrofanov, Economical Telegram Channel. I would like to go further after the question that was raised, the first one today, because my interest wasn't met. Last week, Bloomberg printed an article that allegedly two systemic banks contacted the Central Bank of Russia with a request for potential recapitalization over the next 12 months. I don't want you to comment on these, but I would like to hear, what if all of a sudden, indeed, the banks might need recapitalization? What kind of support, what kind of toolkit the Central Bank might offer? Reducing the standards temporarily or becoming part of these banks' equity? That's what I'm interested to hear. You don't want me to comment on these rumors, but again, I will say that these are just rumors, unfounded, and so it seems to me that it's intentional, hyping. I can again quote the figures to explain that there is no reason to feel concerns. You need to take a look at the financial indicators. The banks are stable, they are earning profit, they have capital reserves, so it all allows them to feel feel quite sure of their future. But even if hypothetically, I shall underscore, hypothetically, looking at a stress kind of scenario, let's say that some of the banks may be up against the capital adequacy standards. Well, I mean, they have the possibility to control situation without any external help, which is reducing the credit portfolio growth rate. If you don't have any capital sources, if it's a low-profit banks, if they're not able to grow their capital out of profit, that they would simply be doing it slower, simply because the overall capital reserve in the banking system is existing. Some banks just may simply grow slower. In other cases, it could be securitization of the credit portfolio into the market. Principally speaking, this is quite a standard set of procedures. We're keeping our eye on everything going on, but I don't see any reason to offer government support in this or that form. Thank you. The next question comes from online, from Alexei Ugarov. The Republic of Tatarstan newspaper, many telegram channels stated that the July utility tariff growth throughout the whole country ended up being higher than previously announced. The basic reason is that in the different regions, tariffs went up differently. In some cases, it went up 20%. Now, how does the Bank of Russia take into account this unevenness? Because the businesses do take into account these in pricing their products and services. And the population also is quite sensitive to such hikes. Won't it affect the inflation expectations and translate into the future key rate decisions? Well, of course, people consider inflation in most cases, once they receive the utility bills, if they see bigger figures, then people would expect general growth of prices, and that impacts inflation expectations, like I said. Now, why are we worried by inflation expectations? Because they are very material, very tangible, although you call them expectations, because specifically based on individual expectations towards the way prices may grow into the future, people decide at this point in time what they have to do, to spend, to save, or to spend more or less. If people are not very much inclined to believe that inflation is going to go down and that this going down process is going to be serious for long, that will jump up the prices, and that would narrow the room for the key rate to be brought down. Now, as far as the unevenness of utility tariff growth throughout the regions is concerned, this unevenness is something that you see everywhere. That applies not only to the utility service, but also to price growth with regard to all other products and services. And by the way, in our part of the report in the regional economy, we are demonstrating how diverse the situation is throughout different regions. But in the regions where authorities are paying attention more to developing competition, to developing manufacturing capacities, we see that the prices demonstrate slower growth, while in others, faster growth. On more than one occasion, we used to say that not only the demand impacts inflation, but also the product offering and whether manufacturing plans are being made and implemented. Another point, the lower is the general level of inflation, because through the key rate we influence it, the less is the difference in between prices in different regions. When inflation was 4%, the price growth in different regions was much, cushioned and almost even. Now, with the lower inflation, we believe it would also fall again. Mr. Zabotkin, a couple of things. When we used to have low inflation close to 4%, so there's diversity in between different regions with the lowest inflation, with the highest inflation, and the annual inflation was at about 3.5 percentage points. Now it's 7 in 2022. When we had a very high inflation throughout the year, it was above 10%. So the lower is the inflation, the more evenly it impacts all the regions. Dear colleagues, please, are there any more questions left? Anna, in the last row, please. Good afternoon, Anna Gromova, Anna Finance blog. During the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, you mentioned that the central bank has prepared a project of an ideal IPO. The document calls for a very serious preparation of companies for placement, including the motivation for the management. It will be very interesting for me to find out what do you believe is the fundamental things to see that a government company is ready to go for an IPO. Particularly, I'm interested to hear what you might say about what needs to be changed in terms of the management work approaches and its incentives. Thank you very much. As far as preparing a government company for an IPO, it is important to have an understanding that one should combine both the government interests as a controlling shareholder with the interests of new private minority shareholders. Because private shareholders and minorities are interested in earning a certain revenue, which is not going to be lower than the market level. And so the mindset of the management in the government companies particularly plays a particular role, because the management must be interested in a good quality placement at an adequate price, but similarly it might be interested in the future growth of the company's capitalization. Throughout the world, the long-term incentivization programs are being used where management is given some of the stock. In Russia, we also have it amongst the new issues as well as the old-timers in the stock market. And these are the kind of programs which enable the management, upon reaching a certain KPIs, to be remunerated with the shares, or are given the opportunity to buy shares at a price lower than the market. Well, in the government companies, the LTI program, long-term incentivization, cannot yet be applied because the variable part, where it must depend upon the operational KPI, it cannot be dependent upon capitalization. While in our case, we specifically need the management to do hard work in order to make this attractive in the minds of investors and shareholders for the management to work for higher capitalization. You might have known that the Minister of Finance made a proposition to introduce an amendment into the government decree which would eliminate this barrier. I mean, for the government companies to use such long-term incentivization programs. We support it because we believe this is principally important in order, how you put it, to create the management incentivization program. And it is also important for the government companies to commit themselves to reporting and disclosure, because investors need to learn information not at the point in time when they buy stock in the market, because when the companies become public, they take responsibility to report and disclose. It is also important to dispose of the acquired shares, respectively. So reporting and disclosure is crucial, and that is why we're continuously in discussion with the government and to make sure that this happens. Dear colleagues, please, Elena Fabricna, yeah? Elena Fabricna, Reuters. Amongst internal factors applied to the future key rate trajectory, we see that the key one is the country budget. I think you do have certain preliminary discussions with the Minister of Finance. Should one expect any surprise by the fall of this year? May they start consolidation? So will anything change in the cut-off situation and as far as the fiscal rule or the budget is concerned? Well, the fiscal policy is indeed a very important factor for decision-making. Let me remind you about our principles. We've always been acting on the publicly announced budgetary policy parameters, but in the same token, we invariably underscore that any changes in the budget may bring about a risk to us and may require a certain trajectory for the key rate. But at the same time, fiscal policy is not the only parameter that generates impact, because, like I said, with respect to the exchange rate and the monetary policy, we do take into account it comprehensively. So we don't expect any surprises to happen in the autumn. At least we're not aware of any of them to happen. I know that many currently are concerned by a possible reduction of commodity prices, and as a result of it, a certain shortfall in terms of the government income. But the monetary policy is monitoring not only changes in incomes, but the structural deficit, because simple expansion of a deficit related to the lower income doesn't generate any tangible impact upon the fiscal policy impact upon inflation, because that's the fiscal rule thing. So the most important thing to us, I guess, is to follow the fiscal rule. Now, is the fiscal rules stable against the external changes? Well, that is worth debating, including the oil price cutoff. But we feel that if it is to be changed, then it should be made more tighter, considering the long-term trends in the commodity markets, amongst other things. So a lower cutoff price will bring about better stability, better resilience against the external shocks from the energy markets, for example. So this is an important indicator. Thanks very much. The next question comes online from Anton Larin, Belgorod TV station. Anton, please.
Elvira Nabiullina, hello, dear colleagues. A high key rate brought about slower inflation, as we see from the statistics and hear from the Central Bank of Russia experts. But in informal discussions with the businessmen, very often you hear skepticism, i.e. that the economy is really not coping it and that the reduction of the key rate is just a political ruse. Could you comment on this, please? Well, yes, of course, there are so many voices and expert opinions in favor of the key rate being brought down, quite clearly. Actually, we don't take it as a pressure upon us. And so the key rate decision, as is under the law, we make based upon our own analysis of the current situation, of the risks involved, and we run a lot of surveys with the households and businesses. We meet the economic agents in order to make our mind, and these surveys do demonstrate that it is slowing down. But of course, it is not the same in all sectors. There are certain companies who find it very difficult. I mean, the ones who, over the previous periods, have accepted a lot of debt and were not really savvy with managing their debt. But generally speaking, we expect positive growth, and the high financial result from the previous years is supporting the companies these days, despite the fact that their current period financial results are not what it used to be. Well, such talk, to the extent that the central bank is reducing the key rate despite inflation, and that the reduction of the key rate is the result of the pressure being exerted upon it despite inflation. I mean, such attempts I would describe as a bad service, because if something like that happens, then the country may feel concerned that the central bank brought the key rate down, not because inflation is going down, but because the pressure was put upon it, which means, or would mean, that the inflation actually would be higher, particularly if you hear the certain voices which are saying that you may live for several years with a high inflation and with a softer ruble. What will happen in such a case is this: the inflation expectations will remain longer at a high level. They will remain unanchored for a longer period of time. And as far as we're concerned, that will require a longer period of a tight monetary policy, which won't translate into any lowering of the rate. You know, we look at it hypothetically, but we definitely base ourselves upon expert opinion, and what businesses think is not just an expert review. It is important for us to understand and know what is going on in specific companies and entities. We are very thoroughly monitoring the financial reporting of individual companies as well as individual sectors and individual regions. Well, colleagues, the time is running up. Just a couple of questions, please. Ekaterina? Good afternoon. Ekaterina Litova from Vedomosti. Today, Marat Husnullin, our Vice Premier, was heard saying that the government right now is considering the initiative set on by the Russian MPs to differentiate the rate on the family mortgage depending upon the region and the number of children in a family. What does the Bank of Russia think about differentiated rates within the subsidized mortgage? And what, generally speaking, the Bank of Russia thinks about the changing of such a program? Well, I mean, it is truly the authority of the government, because we participated in the recent debates. What kind of differentiation parameters you're talking about, I am not aware yet. But to make it more customized, more individualized in terms of the family policy, in terms of the regional differentiation, this is plausible and feasible, but I believe this should take place within the currently existing volume of the mortgage subsidized program, because spreading or broadening subsidized programs will lead to us holding higher key rates for the rest of the economic agents. I mean, if this is what being discussed, definitely within the currently existing volume. Thanks very much, Artyom. Your question is the last one, please. Artyom Govoron, Invest Future. My question about the recent big news about the sale of the Softcom Bank's 5% stock through Avito. We already learned that certain strange situations happen when marketplaces go into financial activity and the central bank warns us about possible risks. So what's your attitude towards this particular case? Can we hypothetically end up having such marketplaces and that it would be permitted to sell financial instruments? Well, you know, one thing is making an announcement of such a sale. You can place it and see it any way you want, because we have an advertising legislation that one must comply with, and it's a totally different thing, the act of such a sale. On financial platforms, the so-called financial marketplaces, is where you can already buy stocks and the mutual funds, but not the bonds. If you mean the organized trading via marketplaces, in order for that to happen, these platforms will require to be licensed and comply with a lot of regulations. No regulatory arbitrage can be allowed for this. Thanks very much, dear colleagues, for very interesting questions.